My son from Texas looked nothing like me. My wife hid the truth. Have you ever looked at your own child and felt like you were staring at a stranger? Have you ever felt that crushing weight in your chest when you realized that everything you believed about your life might have been built on lies? If you had gone through everything I went through in your life, you would also understand why at 53 years old, I'm sitting here in my pickup truck outside a diner in small-town Texas, afraid to go home to face my own son. My name is James, and I'm a veteran of the Iraq War. Over 50 years, you think you've been through all that life can throw at you. You think you've seen the worst of humanity in those desert trenches, heard the most heartbreaking stories from your fellow soldiers, felt the deepest fear when bombs exploded around your convoy. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the moment I discovered that my 17-year-old son might not be my son at all. It started 3 months ago with a simple school project. Tommy needed a family tree for his history class, and my wife Sarah suggested we do one of those DNA kits that were becoming so popular. "It'll be fun, honey," she said with that sweet smile that had charmed me since we were teenagers. "We can trace our roots back to Ireland like your grandmother always claimed." I remember thinking how innocent it all seemed, how this little plastic tube would just confirm what we already knew about our family. After having lived so much fear during my 3 tours in Iraq, my head screams of so much inner loneliness that sometimes I forget what normal family life should feel like. The transition from military life back to civilian life had been harder than I ever admitted to Sarah. Those first few years after I came back in 2008, I struggled with feeling disconnected from my own family. Sarah would try to include me in conversations about Tommy's school activities, his baseball games, his friends, but I felt like I was watching their lives through thick glass. The mirror does not give me back the image of courage that I had when I wore that uniform. Instead, I see a man who spent so many years following orders, living in structured environments, sleeping in barracks with dozens of other men, that coming back to the quiet suburbs of Austin, Texas felt like landing on an alien planet. Sarah would find me sitting on our back porch at 3 in the morning just staring at the stars, trying to process the silence. In Iraq, silence meant danger. At home, silence meant I was supposed to be at peace, but peace felt more terrifying than war. Those early years of readjustment were filled with moments I'm not proud of. I remember one evening when Tommy was about 8 years old, he ran up to me excited about some drawing he'd made at school. The sudden movement, the loud voice, triggered something in me that sent me diving behind the couch thinking we were under attack. Sarah found me there 20 minutes later, trembling and confused, while Tommy stood in the corner crying because he thought he'd done something wrong. The moments of anguish and sadness were overwhelming inside me during those first few years back home. I threw myself into work at the construction company, taking on extra shifts, working weekends, anything to avoid being home where I felt like such a failure as a father and husband. Sarah would pack me lunches with little notes tucked inside, trying to maintain our connection, but I felt like I was disappointing her every single day. I know that there are many soldiers like me who have lost friends, colleagues, and did everything they could to find answers that would comfort them when they returned home. If my story touches your heart, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because every day I share real stories that need to be told. Your support helps me reach even more people who need to know they're not alone in feeling lost after service. Tommy was always a quiet kid, more interested in books and computers than the outdoor activities I tried to interest him in. While other fathers were teaching their sons to hunt or fish, Tommy preferred to stay inside reading science fiction novels or working on some computer programming project. Sarah would always defend him when I expressed frustration about his lack of interest in traditionally masculine activities. "He's just different, James," she'd say. "Not every boy needs to be a carbon copy of his father." Looking back now, those words sting in ways she probably never intended. Not every boy needs to be a carbon copy of his father. What if he wasn't a copy because he wasn't my son at all? The DNA results came back on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Sarah was at her book club and Tommy was at soccer practice. Yes, he'd eventually joined the team, though more to please me than out of genuine interest. I opened the email on my laptop in our kitchen, expecting to see confirmation of our Irish heritage. Maybe some distant cousins we'd never heard of, the kind of mildly interesting information that would make for good dinner conversation. Instead, I found myself staring at a screen that showed Tommy shared 0% DNA with me. 0. Not one single genetic marker connected us. The room started spinning, and I had to grip the edge of the kitchen counter to keep from falling. My hands were shaking the same way they did during my first firefight in Fallujah. But this was different. This was worse. In war, you know who your enemy is. You can see them, fight them, defeat them, or be defeated by them. But how do you fight the possibility that your entire life has been built on a lie? How do you process the idea that the child you've worried about, provided for, loved in your awkward post-war way for 17 years might not be yours? I must have sat there for 2 hours just staring at those results, refreshing the page hoping it was some kind of mistake. The numbers didn't change. Tommy's DNA profile showed he was predominantly Hispanic with some European ancestry, while mine showed the Irish and German heritage we'd expected. We weren't father and son. We were strangers who'd been sharing a house for 17 years. When Sarah came home that evening, humming some tune from her book club meeting, carrying a plate of leftover cookies that Mrs. Henderson had made, I couldn't even look at her. She chattered about her day, about how the book club had discussed some romance novel, about how she'd run into our neighbor at the grocery store, all while I sat there feeling like my entire world had just collapsed. "Did you get the DNA results back?" she asked casually, hanging her purse on the hook by the door. "I'm so curious about whether your grandmother was right about that Irish connection." I turned my laptop screen toward her without saying a word. I watched her face change as she read the results. The color drained from her cheeks and she sat down heavily in the chair across from me. For the first time in 22 years of marriage, Sarah was completely speechless. "James, she started, but the words died in her throat. That's when I knew. In that moment of silence, in the way her eyes darted away from mine, in the way her hands started trembling just like mine had earlier, I knew that she had always known the truth. The silence that filled our kitchen that night was heavier than any bomb blast I'd experienced in Iraq. At least in combat, the silence meant the immediate danger had passed. This silence meant the danger was just beginning. Sarah sat across from me, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the DNA results on my laptop screen like they were written in some foreign language she couldn't understand. "How long have you known?" I asked, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. The question hung in the air between us like smoke from a battlefield. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she still couldn't look at me directly. "James, please, let me explain." "How long?" I repeated, each word feeling like it was being ripped from my chest. "Since before Tommy was born," she whispered, and those 6 words hit me harder than any improvised explosive device ever had. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound I'd received during my tours. In war, you learn to compartmentalize pain, to push through injuries because your brothers depend on you. But this pain had nowhere to go. It spread through every memory I had of the past 18 years, contaminating moments I'd treasured, making me question every single thing I thought I knew about my life. I stood up so fast my chair fell backward, clattering against the tile floor. The sound made Sarah jump, and for a moment I saw fear in her eyes. That look reminded me of the Iraqi civilians we'd encountered during house-to-house searches, that mixture of terror and guilt that people wear when they know they've been caught. "I need to walk," I said, grabbing my jacket from the hook by the door. "James, please don't leave. We need to talk about this." But I was already out the door, my boots hitting the pavement with the same rhythmic pattern I'd used during countless military marches. The October air was crisp, carrying the smell of burning leaves and the distant sound of high school football practice. Normal suburban sounds that felt surreal given what I'd just learned. I walked for hours through our neighborhood, past houses where other families were probably sitting down to normal dinners, helping kids with homework, arguing about typical family problems like curfews and allowances. Meanwhile, my entire foundation had just crumbled and I didn't even know how to begin processing it. Over 50 years, you think you've developed the emotional tools to handle anything life throws at you. The Army teaches you resilience, adaptability, how to remain calm under pressure. But they don't teach you how to handle discovering that your wife has been lying to you since before your child was born. They don't prepare you for the possibility that every bedtime story you read, every soccer game you attended, every proud moment you felt watching your son grow up, was based on deception. The memories started flooding back as I walked. I remembered Sarah's reaction when she first told me she was pregnant. We'd been trying for 2 years with no success, and I'd started to worry that maybe my time in Iraq, exposure to chemicals and depleted uranium, might have affected my ability to have children. When she came to me with tears of joy, telling me we were finally going to be parents, I'd felt like the luckiest man alive. Now I understood why she'd cried. They probably weren't tears of joy at all. I thought about the pregnancy, how Sarah had been unusually anxious about doctor appointments, how she'd insisted we didn't need to know the baby's sex ahead of time, how she'd seemed nervous whenever we discussed baby names. I'd attributed her anxiety to normal first-time mother worries, but now I wondered if she'd been terrified that the baby would come out looking obviously different from me. When Tommy was born, I remember standing in that delivery room holding this tiny, perfect human being, feeling overwhelmed with love and responsibility. Sarah had looked exhausted but relieved, and I'd thought it was just the natural relief of getting through childbirth. Now I wondered if her relief was about something entirely different. The worst part was remembering all the times over the years when people would comment on how Tommy didn't look like me. "He must get his looks from his mother's side," they'd say, laughing. Sarah would always agree quickly, sometimes too quickly, and change the subject. I'd noticed it but never thought much about it. Tommy had Sarah's dark hair and eyes, her olive complexion, while I was fair-skinned with light brown hair and blue eyes. Genetics can be funny, I'd always told myself, but genetics aren't that funny apparently. As I walked past the park where I'd taught Tommy to ride his bike, where we'd played catch even though he was never really interested, where I'd pushed him on swings when he was little, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my worst days in Iraq: complete and utter helplessness. In combat, even in the most dangerous situations, you have options. You can fight, you can retreat, you can call for backup, you can adapt your strategy. But how do you fight 17 years of lies? How do you retreat from being a father? How do you call for backup when the person you trusted most in the world has been deceiving you since day one? The isolation I'd felt after returning from war seemed trivial compared to this. At least then, I'd had Sarah to lean on, Tommy to motivate me to get better, a family worth fighting for. Now I felt like I was drowning in questions with no good answers. Who was Tommy's real father? Did he know about Tommy? Was he someone I knew? Someone from our neighborhood, from Sarah's work, from our church? The possibilities tormented me as I walked through streets I'd lived on for 15 years, wondering if I'd been unknowingly greeting the man who'd fathered my son every time I picked up the mail or mowed the lawn. When I finally returned home around midnight, all the lights were off except for the lamp in our bedroom. Sarah was still awake, sitting up in bed with red, puffy eyes and tissues scattered around her. She'd been crying for hours, but I felt no sympathy for her tears. She'd had 18 years to tell me the truth. She'd chosen deception every single day for 18 years. "Is Tommy asleep?" I asked, hanging my jacket back on its hook. She nodded. "He came home from practice and went straight to his room. I don't think he knows anything's wrong yet." "Yet," I repeated. "But he's going to find out, isn't he? Because this can't stay hidden anymore." Sarah's face crumpled, and she started crying again. "James, I never meant for it to happen. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake, and I've regretted it every day since." "Every day for 18 years?" I sat down in the chair across from our bed, maintaining distance between us. "If you regretted it so much, why didn't you tell me?" "Because I loved you," she sobbed. "Because I knew it would destroy us, and I couldn't bear to lose you. You were about to deploy to Iraq, and I was so scared you might not come back. I couldn't send you to war knowing about this." Her explanation only made it worse. She'd made the decision to lie to me while I was preparing to risk my life for our country, for our family, for the life we'd built together. While I was lying awake at night, worried about providing for her and our unborn child, she was keeping this devastating secret. "Who is he?" I asked. Sarah's crying intensified and she shook her head. "Who is Tommy's father, Sarah? You owe me that much." The name she whispered changed everything I thought I knew about betrayal, about trust, about the people closest to us. It was someone I knew well, someone I'd trusted, someone whose betrayal cut almost as deep as Sarah's. But that revelation would have to wait until morning, because as I sat there in our bedroom looking at the woman I'd loved for over 20 years, I realized that learning Tommy's parentage was just the beginning. The real question was, what happens to a family built on lies when the truth finally comes out? The name Sarah whispered that night was my brother Michael, my younger brother Michael, who had been my best man at our wedding. Michael, who had visited us regularly during our early marriage. Michael, who had conveniently gotten a job transfer to Denver right around the time Tommy was born and had rarely visited since. Michael, who I'd always thought was just busy building his own life, but who now I realized had been running from the consequences of destroying mine. I spent that night sitting in my truck in the driveway, unable to go back inside the house, unable to drive away, just sitting in the darkness trying to understand how two people I'd loved and trusted more than anyone else in the world could have betrayed me so completely. The worst part wasn't even the affair itself. People make mistakes, marriages go through rough patches, attraction happens even when it shouldn't. The worst part was the systematic deception that followed. Every birthday party where Michael sent cards and gifts to Tommy from a distance, every Christmas when he called to talk to his nephew, every family gathering he'd missed with convenient excuses, it had all been an elaborate performance to hide the truth. As I sat there in my truck, I thought about my deployment to Iraq and how it had happened right after Sarah told me she was pregnant. I'd been so excited to be a father, so motivated to serve my country and come home to my growing family. I'd carried Tommy's ultrasound picture in my helmet, shown it to my fellow soldiers, talked endlessly about my unborn son. Meanwhile, Sarah had been terrified, not because her husband was going to war, but because she was carrying her brother-in-law's child and hoping against hope that the baby would somehow look enough like me that no one would ever question his parentage. The memories of my time in Iraq took on a completely different meaning now. All those nights I'd lain on my cot thinking about Sarah and the baby, writing letters home, counting down the days until I could hold my son for the first time. I'd been risking my life for a family that wasn't even mine, motivated by a love that was based on lies. I remembered the day Tommy was born. I'd been on patrol in Fallujah when I got the message through our communications officer. The birth had happened 3 weeks early, and I'd been worried sick until I got confirmation that both mother and baby were healthy. I'd celebrated with my unit, passed out cigars that someone had sent from home, felt that incredible rush of pride and love that comes with becoming a father. 3 weeks early. Now I understood why. Sarah hadn't been wrong about her due date. Tommy had been born exactly when he was supposed to be born, based on when he was actually conceived. When I finally came home from that deployment, Tommy was 6 months old. I'd missed his first few months, his first smiles, his first attempts at solid food. Sarah had apologized repeatedly for me missing those milestones, but now I wondered if she'd actually been relieved that I wasn't there to witness Tommy's early development, to potentially notice things that might have raised questions. I'd thrown myself into being the best father I could be, trying to make up for lost time. I'd been patient with Tommy's quiet nature, his lack of interest in the activities I'd loved as a kid. I'd attributed it to personality differences, to him being more like his mother. Now I realized he was like his actual father, my brother, who had always been more cerebral than physical, more interested in books and intellectual pursuits than outdoor activities. The pieces of the puzzle kept falling into place, and each one felt like a punch to the gut. Tommy's aptitude for mathematics and science, subjects that Michael had excelled in but that had always challenged me. Tommy's way of tilting his head when he was thinking hard about something, a gesture I'd always thought was uniquely his but now realized was identical to something Michael did. Even Tommy's laugh, which I'd never quite been able to place, sounded exactly like Michael's when I really thought about it. At sunrise, I finally went back inside the house. Sarah was in the kitchen making coffee, and she looked like she hadn't slept at all. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and she jumped when she heard me come through the door. "James," she started, but I held up my hand to stop her. "I need to know everything," I said. "Not just the sanitized version you think I can handle. Everything. How it started, how long it went on, whether it ever happened again, what you told Michael, what you decided together. Everything." Sarah poured herself a cup of coffee with shaking hands. "It only happened once," she said quietly. "You and I had been fighting a lot about you enlisting, about you wanting to volunteer for deployment. I was scared and angry and feeling abandoned. Michael came over one evening to try to talk to me about supporting your decision, and you slept with him. It wasn't planned. We'd both been drinking. We were both emotional about you leaving, and it just happened. Immediately afterward, we both knew it was a terrible mistake. Michael left that night and barely spoke to me until after you deployed. But you didn't tell me." Sarah's tears started again. "How could I? You were about to go to war. I couldn't destroy our marriage and send you into combat distracted and heartbroken. And then when I found out I was pregnant, you hoped it was mine. I prayed it was yours. I did the math over and over, trying to convince myself that the timing could work out. When Tommy was born early, I told myself that proved he was yours, even though deep down I knew the truth." The conversation was interrupted by footsteps on the stairs. Tommy appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in his pajamas, his dark hair sticking up at odd angles. He looked so much like Sarah, but now I could see Michael in his features too. The shape of his nose, the way his eyebrows curved, the set of his jaw. "Morning," Tommy said, heading for the cereal cabinet. "You guys are up early." Sarah and I exchanged a look. Tommy didn't know yet. As far as he was concerned, I was still his dad, and this was still a normal morning in a normal family. The innocence in his voice, the casual way he moved around the kitchen that he'd grown up in, made my heart ache in ways I couldn't have imagined. "Tommy," I said, my voice coming out rougher than I intended, "can you sit down for a minute? Your mom and I need to talk to you about something important." The look of mild confusion that crossed Tommy's face reminded me so much of Michael when we were kids that I had to grip the edge of the counter to steady myself. This was the moment when everything would change forever, not just for me and Sarah, but for Tommy too. He was about to learn that the man who'd raised him, who'd tried his best to be a good father despite his struggles with post-war adjustment, wasn't his biological father. He was about to learn that his mother had been keeping this secret his entire life, and that his uncle, his real father, had been playing an elaborate game of pretend for 17 years. As Tommy sat down at our kitchen table looking back and forth between Sarah and me with growing concern, I realized that this conversation would define the rest of all our lives. There was no going back from this moment, no way to unknow what we now knew, no way to return to the comfortable fiction we'd been living. The truth was finally going to come out, and I had no idea whether any of us were strong enough to survive it. "Tommy," I began, looking at this young man who'd been my son for 17 years, but who might not be my son at all. "There's something you need to know about your family history project." The DNA results were still open on my laptop, and I turned the screen toward him. Tommy leaned forward, reading the data with the same focused concentration I'd seen him apply to his homework countless times. I watched his face change as he processed the information, saw the exact moment when the implications hit him. "This says we're not related," he said quietly, looking up at me with confusion and the beginning of fear in his dark eyes. Eyes that now I could see were exactly like Michael's. "That's right," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "And your mother has something to tell you about why that might be." Sarah was crying again, but she managed to speak through her tears. "Tommy, honey, before you were born, before your dad deployed to Iraq, I made a terrible mistake. I was with someone else, and there's a chance that person might be your biological father instead of dad." Tommy's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, anger, hurt. It was like watching someone age several years in a matter of seconds. "Who?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Your Uncle Michael," Sarah said, and Tommy's face went completely white. The silence that followed was deafening. Tommy sat there staring at both of us like we'd just told him he was adopted by aliens. Finally, he spoke. "Uncle Michael who lives in Denver? Uncle Michael who's Dad's brother? That Uncle Michael?" Sarah nodded, unable to meet his eyes. Tommy stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "So you're telling me that my entire life has been a lie? That the man I call Dad might not be my dad? And my uncle might actually be my father, and everyone has just been pretending this whole time?" "Tommy," I started, but he cut me off. "No," he said, his voice getting louder. "No, this is insane. This is completely insane. I'm 17 years old and you're just now telling me this? How long have you known?" He looked at Sarah with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Pure anger. "I've suspected since before you were born," Sarah admitted. Tommy stared at her for a long moment, then looked at me. "And you?" "I found out yesterday when the DNA results came back," I said. Something in Tommy's expression shifted when he realized I'd been deceived too. The anger was still there, but now it was mixed with something that looked almost like sympathy. "So what happens now?" Tommy asked. "Do I call Uncle Michael? Do I pretend this conversation never happened? Do I start calling you by your first name instead of Dad?" The question hit me like a physical blow. In all my processing of Sarah's betrayal, all my anger at Michael's deception, I hadn't really considered what this meant for my relationship with Tommy. He'd been my son for 17 years. I'd raised him, worried about him, loved him, been proud of him. DNA tests couldn't erase 17 years of being his father. "You call me whatever feels right to you," I said. "Biology doesn't erase history. I've been your dad for 17 years and that doesn't change just because we found out we don't share DNA. Tommy's eyes filled with tears. But it does change things, doesn't it? Everything's different now. He was right, of course. Everything was different. But looking at this young man who I'd watched grow from a baby into someone I was genuinely proud of, I realized that my love for him hadn't changed in the past 24 hours. If anything, seeing his maturity in handling this devastating news made me love him more. Some things change, I said carefully. Your mother and I need to figure out our marriage. You might want to have a relationship with Michael as your biological father. There are going to be a lot of difficult conversations and decisions ahead of us. But, I continued, standing up and walking over to where Tommy was standing by the counter, you're still my son in every way that matters. That I still love you, I'm still proud of you, and I still want to be part of your life in whatever way you'll have me. Tommy looked up at me. He'd inherited Sarah's height, rather than my 6'2" frame, and I saw tears running down his cheeks. I don't know what to do with this information, he said honestly. Neither do I admitted. But we'll figure it out together, okay? Tommy nodded. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt like maybe we could survive this. Over the next few weeks, our family had to completely redefine itself. Tommy and I had long conversations about what our relationship meant and how it might change going forward. Sarah and I started couples counseling, though I wasn't sure our marriage could survive this level of betrayal. The hardest part was dealing with Michael. Tommy wanted to talk to him, to understand his side of the story, to begin building some kind of relationship with his biological father. I supported Tommy's decision, but I wasn't ready to forgive my brother for 18 years of deception. When Michael finally came to visit, his first trip back to Texas in over a decade, the resemblance between him and Tommy was unmistakable. They had the same laugh, the same way of running their hands through their hair when they were nervous, the same slight stutter when they got excited about something. Watching them together was painful, but it also provided a strange sense of closure. Tommy's personality traits that had always puzzled me suddenly made perfect sense. His love of reading, his aptitude for mathematics, his preference for indoor activities. He was Michael's son in temperament as much as in genetics. The conversation between Michael and me was brief and difficult. He apologized, explained that he'd been young and stupid, said he'd regretted it every day since. I wasn't ready to accept his apology, but I wasn't ready to cut him out of our lives entirely either, especially since Tommy wanted a relationship with him. Sarah and I ultimately decided to separate. The trust that had been broken couldn't be repaired, at least not quickly enough to save our marriage. But we committed to co-parenting Tommy together, to helping him navigate this complicated new family dynamic. Tommy handled everything with a maturity that amazed me. He maintained his relationship with me while building a new one with Michael. He was hurt by Sarah's deception but forgave her more quickly than I was able to. He adapted to our new family structure with the resilience that I recognized from my military training. Sometimes the mission changes, but you keep moving forward. Now, 6 months later, I can say that while our family looks completely different than it did before those DNA results came back, we're all still here. Tommy still calls me Dad, still comes to me for advice, still makes me proud every day. Sarah and I are working toward friendship, if not reconciliation. Michael is slowly becoming part of Tommy's life in a way that honors both his biological connection and my role as the man who raised him. The truth didn't destroy us the way I feared it might. Instead, it forced us to rebuild our family on a foundation of honesty rather than comfortable lies. It's harder this way, more complicated, more painful at times, but it's also more real. To anyone listening who's facing their own family crisis, who's discovered their own devastating truths, I want you to know that survival is possible. Families can be redefined, love can transcend biology, and sometimes the truth, as painful as it is, can lead to something stronger than what came before. Over 50 years, I've learned that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about facing your fears and moving forward anyway. Our family faced the truth together, and we're still standing. That's something to be proud of, even when everything else has changed. Tommy starts college next year. He's considering studying computer science, like his biological father, but he's also thinking about engineering, inspired by all those years watching me work construction. He's a perfect blend of both his parents, all four of us, and he's going to be just fine. That's the most important thing I learned from this whole experience. Love is stronger than genetics. Family is about choice as much as blood. And the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than living a lie. If you're out there struggling with your own family secrets, your own painful truths, remember that you're stronger than you think you are. You can survive this, whatever this is for you. And maybe if you're lucky, you'll discover that what's real is even better than what you thought you had.